In this video, I want to talk you through some basic introduction to clause structure in Greek, and then I want to talk you through how to create a structural layout so you can complete the assignment in Philippians 3, 2 through 14 that's coming up next week. Essentially, we're going to cover this in contradistinction to diagramming. Diagramming is a tool that focuses on the grammar of the word and the phrase. It's very particular. It's focusing on the small units. But structural layouts focus on the grammar of the clause and the sentence. They look at higher structures, higher in the sense that they're larger, so that you can have a simpler tool that helps you see the flow of an author's argument. It's kind of hard to track what Paul is arguing for when you have a diagram, but when you have a structural layout, you can see the pieces in a different way that enables you to see what he has elevated in his understanding, what he has subordinated, etc. So it's meant to be a tool that helps you look at something in a different way than a diagram would. Now, what I want to start with, though, is a comparison of the phrase and the sentence. Sometimes we use these terms a lot in grammar, and it's important to be able to define them. So I want to start that way. First, let's talk about a phrase. A phrase is a group of words which function together, but it lacks a verb. For example, the big dog. That's a group of words. They obviously are functioning together as an article, an adjective, and a noun, but they don't have a verb. It's not making any type of assertion. So we argue that phrases are dependent. They cannot function on their own. Now, a clause is also a group of words which function together, but they contain a verb. For example, running after the cat. That is a group of words that makes sense. We understand what it's asserting, but it's not independent. It can't function on its own, and it contains a verb as opposed to the prior example that I used. Now, a sentence is a clause or group of clauses which function together. The dog running after the cat fell down the hill, something to that effect. That contains a subject and a verb, and that's an independent unit. No matter how we construct a sentence, it can stand on its own. It's what we might consider a basic unit of meaning for Greek and for English as well. So in essence, what we're doing here is focusing on the clause. We're going to look at a group of words which function together that contains a verb, but is dependent. It cannot function on its own. It does not give a complete thought or idea. Now, the next thing that we have to work on is how do we identify clauses? Well, essentially in Greek, we identify them by their verbal element. In other words, we're going to look at that particular verbal structural component that identifies that this is in fact a clause. And in Greek, there are four particular things that we look for. The first is independent verbs, usually indicatives. In other words, it's the main verb in an independent sentence. Usually these are indicatives because in Greek the indicative is oftentimes used to create the basic sentence structure, but it's not the only independent verb that can be used. For example, you've learned about the hortatory subjunctive, and so that's entirely possible, but most of what we're going to be looking at would be indicative verbs, which basically create the structure of an independent sentence or an independent clause. The second structure would be a subordinating conjunction plus their related verb. For example, when the dog ran after the cat, he ran into the street. That subordinating conjunction when uses an indicative verb to create a subordinating clause. And that's exactly what we have in Greek. For example, we have the subordinating conjunction hina, which when used with a subjunctive can indicate purpose or result. And so that's a very common structure that is going to very readily mark a dependent clause. But you can also have adverbial participles. You've learned that participles can take on an adverbial function, and that also creates a clausal structure. Now notice this does not apply to substantival participles or adjectival participles. It's only adverbial participles that create a dependent clausal structure. And the same thing would be the case with adverbial infinitives. Infinitives can do this on their own, but sometimes they are used with prepositions to indicate an adverbial idea. And so you've got to be able to identify that as a component of meaning. But the long and short is that the adverbial infinitive can also create a dependent clausal structure. So those four things are really important. In any time you create a structural layout or work with a paragraph, you want to identify those four elements as the key things that identify a clause. And just to review, an independent verb, usually an indicative, a subordinating conjunction plus their related verb, an adverbial participle, or an adverbial infinitive. Now, what creates the clause is that verbal unit plus everything that's connected to it. You know that verbs, for example, can have direct objects or they can be modified by adverbs. Everything that is connected to that verbal element will be part of that constituent clause. So you have to think, kind of on your feet because not every clause looks the same. But once you identify the verbal elements, you can then identify everything that's connected to them to identify your clausal structure. So as an example, let's take a look at Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 12. I have put this into a Word document so that we can take a look at it. And let's identify the four things that we just focused on. We want to look for indicative verbs that are acting independently, subordinating conjunctions with their related verbs, adverbial participles, and adverbial infinitives. Now, as I scan and read this sentence, there's a couple of things that stand out. You'll notice that we start off with a subordinating conjunction. And so let's go ahead and mark this with a particular color. Let's mark the subordinating conjunctions with green and then their related verbs in the same color. Hata means when, and so it is identifying a dependent clausal structure. Now, as we go further along, we see here antestein is a indicative verb. It is acting independently, so I'm going to mark that with yellow. That's marking an independent clause. And then here we have another subordinating conjunction, hate, plus a related verb. And so let me mark that. And here we have a periphrastic construction. Now, the important thing to note about hate is that it doesn't always indicate subordination. It can also indicate content. Think about its definition. It can mean because or that. When it means that, it's indicating content and it's acting more as a noun, not as an adverb or as a dependent clause. In this instance, it means because, and so we're going to mark it in that way. Now, as we go a little further, we can see right here that we have an infinitive, elfine, and it's functioning adverbially. And so let's mark this with blue. And let's also mark the preposition that's functioning with it in blue. And that's marking a temporal nuance. Here, pra, to, plus the infinitive means before doing such and such. So it's setting up a dependent clause that focuses on time. And now as we go further along, we've got another indicative verb functioning independently. And then we've got another subordinating conjunction with its related verb. And now we've got two independent indicatives. And then the last thing that we've got is a dependent participle. Okay, so that marks all of the elements in this particular paragraph that indicate a clausal structure. And so the next thing that we need to do is to actually focus on creating the structural layout. And so here, the first step to do is to separate the clauses. And that means that we have to put every clause on its own line with all of the elements properly connected. So as we go over back to our Word document, we can see that we have everything marked as a proper clausal verbal element. And now it's simply a matter of separating them such that we've got our clauses differentiated. Now, if you think about it, the punctuation structure in the text can oftentimes be very helpful to us. So, for example, it's very logical to argue that this phrase functions together as a clause. But when Cephas came to Antioch, and that makes great sense. And so let's put a return here and separate that as a clause. And then here, I withstood him to his face. That also stands together. And then here, because he was condemned, period. That makes great sense as a dependent clausal element. So let's set that on its own line. And then as we keep going, we see for before certain men from James arrived, with the Gentiles he ate. Now, this is where we have to use our thinking caps. We have to put them on and think this through. The question is, where does our clause divide? And this is when we have to think through what goes with what. And so it makes great sense to argue that this part of the sentence hangs together. For before certain people came from James, this is what Peter would do. He would eat with the Gentiles. Great, makes perfect sense. And so that becomes a clause on its own. And now, but when they arrived, that's a clause unto itself. What did Peter do? He withdrew and set himself apart. And then this final clause explains why he did that. The dependent participle here is acting causally because he was afraid of those of the circumcision. So here you'll notice that we've got our initial breakdown of the clauses finished. Notice that we have one clause for every verbal element that we have identified. We identified, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different verbal elements, and we've got 8 different clauses that we're going to work with. Now, the next thing that we would do is create subordination through indentation. What that means is that in this particular structure, or this particular model, what we do is we put independent clauses all the way to the left, and then we show dependence by indenting relative to that main clause. So it's very important that we identify our main clauses. You can see we have 3 in this particular instance. Kata prosopon auto antestein, metaton ethnon sunesthein, and then hupastelen kai aphoridzen heauton. Those are our independent clauses. Those are the only things that are going to be on the left margin. Everything else is going to be indented. Now, the question we have to ask is, this particular dependent clause is dependent upon what? It's dependent upon what follows. And so what we're going to do is to simply indent it to show that relationship. Then, here we've got this particular clause, and the question to ask is, it's indented to what? It's dependent upon what precedes, and so we're going to indent in order to show that. Now, in order to not get confused and think, for example, that this clause goes with what follows, let's put an additional space to separate, in essence, our sentences. And so this clause modifies what follows, and now let's put another space. And then this clause modifies what follows. This clause modifies what precedes. So you can see very quickly how this structure helps us. We can see that the major argument that Paul's making is that he withstood Peter to his face because Peter had been eating with the Gentiles, but then he withdrew himself. And the rest of this material explains why he did that, the circumstances surrounding it. It adds commentary and understanding about that particular event. So the long and the short is that that's the way to finish the structural layout. You identify the clauses, you identify all of the particular dependent markers, the dependent verbal elements. You then organize them with indentation to show what they are related to. Now, the particular assignment that you have to work on relates to a particular passage in Philippians, Philippians chapter 3, verses 2 through 14. And there's 2 basic parts to this assignment. The first thing to do is to create a structural layout for that passage based upon what you've learned here and the reading you've done for the class, and do it all on your own. You'll submit that, and that'll be part of the assignment. But then the second part is to take that document and then to assess it. There are a couple of tools in Logos we want you to be familiar with. They do things a little bit differently, but it could provide some insight. And so basically, after you've created the layout and it's all done, you will then take a separate copy of it and then make some notes on it, make some assessment of what you did and how it compares to these other tools. Now, there's 2 tools I want to point out to you. The first is the propositional outlines, and the second is the lexem clausal outlines. If you go over to Logos, you'll see that in the Greek text, you can make some changes with the way things are organized. If you go over to your visual filters and then look under the resource options, you'll see the option for propositional outlines. Now, when you click that, what it will do is it will reorganize your text into a particular outline structure. Now, notice here that there's a lot of differences between what they are putting on the page and what we are putting on the page. And what we want you to do is to basically do some comparisons to see where they might be similar and different, where you might make some corrections based upon what you see here. Notice that this is focused, shall we say, much more on the phrase and a little bit less on the clause, but still it can be helpful for you to look at. Another tool for you to look at is the lexem clausal outlines. Now, in this particular resource, everything is put again into basically a clausal form. Now, you'll notice that there's several things kind of overlapping here. In order to change that, you need to go to the interlinear settings, and then change it so that you only have the manuscript being shown. And that will remove all of that extraneous material. And so you can see here the same thing is being done, but perhaps with a little bit of a different assessment than what's been done in the propositional outlines. So two basically similar tools, but doing things slightly differently, can give you some insight into what you're doing in the text. The last thing that you could look at is commentaries. Oftentimes commentaries will do a clausal layout for a particular passage. For example, the Zondervan exegetical commentary that's recently been done has a lot of those in it. So feel free to look at any commentaries. The main goal is to take what you did and then assess it, see where it could be improved. Do these tools help you in any way? What would you change if you had a second opportunity to do it? So I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, please contact me, and I look forward to working with you further to help you learn this material.